Uh, come on, just come. We're going to talk about Angular 2, and I suppose a lot of people here know Angular 1. Anybody knows Angular 1? Yeah? Good, you're the typical audience that I want. So that's perfect. Before we talk about Angular 1, maybe I should be introducing myself and this formalities stuff. And magic, it works. I can control my laptop from the phone, which is not weird for 2016. But I'm Meligy. I work as a senior consultant in Redify, quite a reputable .NET consulting company. And I write a newsletter for web developers, especially those working with AngularJS on gurustop.net. However, I think the reason I was accepted to talk here is that I run the NG Sydney user group, the Angular user group in Sydney. And it's happening today, actually. So if you're considering something, after the event, you might do that. However, I think if you ever read my name, Meligy, in this conference, it's most likely in the Twitter leaderboard, because I think I was #1 yesterday. So kind of a Twitter addict and not working on a solution currently. So one very quick thing about NG Sydney. We're having it today. We're having Passarat talking about Angular, not React. And with some good luck, we'll be having Josh as well. And more talks about, like, if you're already working with Angular 1 and you want to move to ES6 TypeScript kind of thing, how would you go? So if you'd like to check it out, that'd be cool. Now, let's go into this talk. I already checked it. It's very good that a lot of you do Angular 1 already. And I'd expect that a lot of you have been working with Angular 1 before Angular 1.5, right? Like, who worked with components in Angular 1.5? Not many. That's good, because I'm not going to assume that you know anything about that, because it actually it's like backported from Angular 2. So if you already know it, you wouldn't need to attend this session. So that's all right. I assume there are a lot of .NET people here. It's kind of NDC after all, right? .NET? OK, good. And that's just because we're going to make a few .NET references. So yeah, here's what we're going to talk about. What's kind of new and different in Angular 2? What's surprisingly just the same like Angular 1? Just, who moved my cheese or whatever. And then we're going to talk about, this thing that the Angular team keep talking about, saying, Angular 1 was a framework, Angular 2 is a platform. What does this mean? And after that, we'll try to get realistic, where we are, what's the current state, what are the gotchas, and all this sort of stuff. After this one, after the lunch, there is another Angular 2 talk. It will be Duncan and I think Adam from SSW. They're going to give a little more advanced version of this talk. They're going to talk about, it's all going to be like real life experience, because they have been working on a lot of Angular 2 projects, and they want to tell you, what it's like to actually do this. However, this talk is going to focus more about, how do you translate your knowledge from Angular 1 to Angular 2? So, you all used Angular 1. I guess you loved it. We had, the basic, what's it called, MV star, or I still like to call it, MVCs. You have your controllers, you write JavaScript, you have your HTML, you write templates, data binding works, and it's all good. With that, you get a few extras. So you get forms, you get validation, you get routing, you get dependency injection, you get all this extra stuff, and it's all cool. And you start developing your own ways of work. So okay, in controller, I'll write like light view logic without much DOM manipulation. I'll do DOM manipulation in directives. If there's any complex logic, I'll put it in services. And now I have, the same feeling that I would get from a normal server-side MVC. I like it, it's cool, that works. course, there is a but. The main issues that people seem to have with Angular 1 applications were the fact that you have a scope to assign properties on. That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. However, all the prototype nature of the scope going, $sign parent, $sign root, all this stuff, it can get confusing. It can get, it can cause bugs. It has a lot of issues. Services. How many ways do you have in Angular 1 to define services? There's provider, factory, service, and I think there's something else. So this can be a bit confusing, and it's very Angular specific. Performance with Angular 1 is not bad. However, if you start loading big grids like we sometimes have in our enterprise application and stuff, it starts to have a few glitches, mostly in IE. And usually, there are always solutions to these things, and you might get some third-party grid or whatever, and there are always ways. However, most of the ways that we get tend to be trying to escape from change detection, because that seems to be what's causing all the extra efforts that Angular is doing, and because JavaScript is things threaded, so this blocks the render thread as well, and now it gets a little bit like a hanging feeling. And that's why somebody once said, I can't remember who, that in Angular you get better performance the less Angular feature you use, because the more you escape from the change detection and stuff is good. And then same person also said that with React, the more features of React you use, the faster. I don't know how accurate the React version is, but for Angular 1, definitely, it gets faster the more you go out of the digest loop. So that's Angular world for Angular 1.0 all the way to Angular 1.3, 1.4. But the world is not just Angular, right? There is a lot of things happening in the JavaScript ecosystem. We got ECMAScript 2015, and we actually got, who knows, we also got 2016 as well. That's already released with only 2 features. Who knows what are 2 features? I don't remember. Okay. So there is an array.includes, and there is ** attribute, which allows you to go math to the power of. That's the only thing, only thing is in ECMAScript 2016. But ECMAScript 2015 was the more interesting one because we got arrow functions. We can keep this variable from changing all the time, and we got interpolated strings. We can have template-like strings, and more importantly, the most important features in ECMAScript 2015 maybe are classes and modules. Who here has been to the Scott Allen talk yesterday? Okay, not that many, I guess. Okay, so I'll have to explain a little bit about them. So here is the projector is really not helping. So supposedly this is a class in ECMAScript 2015. It's called Hello World and extends React.component. So that's the React component, and you call render, and then this is not ECMAScript 2015. This is JSX, but everything else is. So we have a class, and we can inherit other classes or extend them, and instead of using, we have imports, and these imports are like modules. So you can think of them as DLLs or namespaces in DLLs as well. And then we have to get React so that we can get the component from it, and we have to get React DOM because React can render to multiple things. So it can render to React Native or whatever. So that's how you do this in React. And if you're doing Ember, is getting into classes as well. If you're doing Aurelia, it's getting into classes. So it looks like the whole world is moving into ECMAScript 2015. What does this bring you? Now, you work with classes, everything you write becomes a module, but browsers don't understand classes, and there is no way to load modules. Like even in the standard for ECMAScript 2015, there was an API called system.import so that you can load a module into the browser, and it didn't get approved. So there is actually there's no official way to load modules. So if you're going to use modules, which everybody seems to like, and if you're going to use classes, just to be friendly to most of the world browsers, you will have to use a transpiler. So you'll have to get a compiler that translates from ECMAScript 2015 to ES5. Well, if you're going to use a transpiler anyway, why don't you go one step farther and use TypeScript? Because if you're going to go all the way to the effort of having a compiler, having a bundler, a thing that tells the browser to understand the modules and all this stuff, why don't you just go one more step? And that's what Angular prefers, Angular 2. So here we have a very similar example to what we had in the React world. We import the component, and we import the browser-specific bootstrap, because Angular 2, just like most of the similar SPA frameworks in JavaScript now, it can compile to native script or React Native or on the server or anything. So here we're saying we're going to use the browser version of the Bootstrap, and the syntax for import for those who haven't come to Scott Allen's talk. You can say import star as Angular. So you could have said import star as Angular, and then say Angular.bootstrap your component, and you can think of your component as your module in Angular 1 concept. And then you find that it's very, very similar to what we had. Now, this component in here, there are two things I want you to notice. First, in Angular 2, you can do attributes. In TypeScript, you can do attributes just like you do in C#. They just call them decorators, and the syntax is slightly different. And instead of these brackets, they use the at. And component is just a function. So when you see a directive like that, it's a function that will get an instance of the class. Like whenever you say new app component, this function will get called, and it will be the one that will return you the instance. So it can modify the instance as well. And we'll talk about how this is useful in just a bit. However, forget about this particular component name. Let's talk about this whole thing. What does this look like to you as an Angular 1 developer? It has a template. It has a function, because classes are just like function. If I put here a constructor, it's like function. And it has a selector. Did I hear a directive somewhere? Yep. That's exactly what you can think of a component. So Angular 1, it started with just controllers, because it was for designers. So the controllers were just so that you would wire the data binding to the UI, and that's it. People started doing crazy things with it, and now it got directives, or at least made the directives available publicly. And now people started working with, okay, now I have a controller, but the directive can have a controller as well. If you did any serious work with the directive, you know that it's not just compile and link. You can also have a controller, like the ng model directive. Most of the work is a thing called ng model controller. And of course, the directive can have a template, so why not? So actually, in Angular 2, components are just subclass of directives. And you can think of it as a directive that has isolated scope, that has transclusion, it overrides with the template. And yes, it can have child content in its template. And the scope is the instance scope. So anything that's like this in here would go into the template. Needless to say, you can have the template inline, or you can have a template URL, just like the directives in Angular 1. If the internet works, this is exactly the same example that you saw. That's why you don't need to really see that code. And if the internet works, you find it working. When you deal with this, here are the parts that you didn't see in the example. In our index, we load a few polyfills, font size, and we just have a custom tag in here. Of course, this custom tag will match the component selector, and that's how the Bootstrap knows to use this. And that's why we didn't even need to tell the Bootstrap in here where to apply the component, like in React, if you noticed, we needed to. In this example, because this example runs completely in the browser, we had to deal with something called SystemJS. And you will have to deal with the same if you are doing any SPA development, and you want to do compilation just in the browser. So SystemJS is a library that tries to polyfill the system.import method that didn't get to make it in the standard. And what we're seeing in here is, first we are mapping all the libraries that we need from NPM CDN, because we don't have local NPM. And then we're saying, OK, here are all the different modules that Angular 2 is split to. We just want to load them. And we load them with this Angular /. Who knows what this Angular / means? Have you ever tried to look for the Bootstrap CSS framework on Bower or NPM? If you did that, you'll probably find so many libraries or Bower modules that look quite the same. It's a bit hard to tell which one is the official one. So NPM has a solution to this problem, which is called scoped packages. So at Angular is like what they call a package namespace. So that's the official Angular thing. And everything underneath is a different NPM module, NPM package that can be loaded separately. You'll probably find yourself a bit overloaded with a lot of concepts that I talk about in here. The problem is these concepts, everybody in the JavaScript world have been starting to use them with React, with Ember, with even Circle, Vue. There's just so many libraries out there, and they all use these concepts. However, for us Angular 1 developers, we're just sticking with our I'll put a script, I'm good. And then when Angular 2 started to just follow the fashion and the trends, we're like, why are they doing this? Well, they didn't start it. They're just really following the trends. Now let's go back to the component bit. Now that you can control how app component is instantiated, because Angular 2 owns the function that will return you an instance of app component whenever it's called, why don't we also use this to do dependency injection, just like the same way you do it in ASP.NET, like AutoFac or whatever. So here I have a constructor injection, and if I add a modifier, like an access modifier, to the parameter in here, it automatically becomes a member of the class. So this is just like if I said private member service in here in the class. That's TypeScript, not Angular 2. So now Angular 2 will know that if anybody provides this user service, it will inject it into here, and now I can, in my template, go and use it. If get name, comes from anything that runs asynchronously, web service that uses the token or whatever, like the user authentication token or anything like that, then we can have this async filter. Except in Angular 2 they call it pipe, but the old is new. It's just a filter. And what this is going to do is it's going to tell the UI, okay, if there is a promise, if this will come from a promise, I will wait until the promise is resolved, and then I'll render it in here. I'm able to write multiple lines in the template because I'm using this stick. So this is not that, if you notice. Yep. And this is like the ECMAScript 2015 strings. That's the key just to the left of number 1 in your keyboard. And now, the only thing this needs in order to work is I need to import the service from here, and that's just so that I can reference it. And you can see that in TypeScript, you can import things from NPM, like I'm doing in here, or just import local files. And this means that I have, in the same folder, I have another folder called shared, and then I have user.service.ts. It's a bit of a convention for this RxJS and then later Webpack and ECMAScript 2015 modules that you don't include the extension. So now in my Bootstrap, I can say, okay, include this user service, and then it will automatically inject it for you. If you remember when I said you can think of the component as a module, and that's because I can also come here and add a thing I call it providers and just pass this particular array, and it will just work. So ECMAScript gave us classes, gave us modules. Arrow functions are handy with classes because if you're using a class, then you're using a lot of methods that are in the class, so you don't really want your this variable to change. And then TypeScript, it gave us decorators, and it gave us types, and we saw that types were very useful in dependency injection. And it gave us interfaces, and interfaces are very nice. So interfaces means you can just define a schema, and instead of a class, and instead of having to say new repository or new user or whatever, you can get whatever JSON is coming from the HTTP and just cast it into the type of the interface without having to create classes or anything. However, we also saw that we had to do all this SystemJS stuff to get things working. If you have a library that's not written for TypeScript, you will have to also include a thing called typing for it that would give you the IntelliSense, that would tell you how to get it. If you don't include the IntelliSense, you can just go ahead and work without typings because typings typings in TypeScript are optional. Like all the types and stuff are optional. Of course, there are a few other things that are happening in the web world. So there's a thing that's called web components, and you might have heard of Polymer, or you might have heard of Shadow DOM. And here I don't mean React Shadow DOM. That's actually abuse of the word, in a way. So Shadow DOM, what it usually means is, if you have a text box with some placeholder in it, how does this placeholder get written? The browser internally writes some div or something inside the text box, and this is DOM. This is it's just HTML, but you can't access it from your JavaScript as and HTML. So it's completely independent. You can't style it unless the browser gives you a special thing, and that's completely isolated. So that's what usually Shadow DOM is, and in HTML5, you can define your own Shadow DOM that doesn't get affected by any style sheets or anything other than the ones that targeted specifically. And another thing that we also found that's happening and not becoming a big deal at all in the developer community is that custom tags are not a big deal anymore. Who here remembers when, using custom attributes in Angular 1 was like, I will not use Angular 1 because custom attributes are not standard. Did anybody get this rejection before? If I used Angular 1 for long enough, people were like, no, I have to add data dash to the attribute so that it's standard. Guess what? Custom tags are now kind of standard, and like you are free to use them on one condition. Just include a dash in them. And this is so that like you are future-proof, so that if the HTML standard introduces new tags, they will never use the dash or hyphen, in the tag names, so you'll never clash with any future HTML tag to come. So you're kind of future-proof, and that's why we will see this in all the Angular components that we create. Now, these are the things that you find that you face when you start working with Angular 2. Oh, TypeScript or different syntax. What are these directives? What are these? However, a lot of things are not that different from what you have. So here's a directive. Who can tell me what this directive does? Yeah, it just sets a background color. So let's talk about how Angular 2 works. When Angular 2 translates your template into HTML, it's using the document.createElement API. They did a lot of testing, and very surprisingly, they found that this was the fastest way to create elements. A very nice bonus that you get when you create the element this way is that you get a reference to the element as well. So it's very easy to get the element as the native element in here. Any idea why we get this element ref and native element, why this complexity exists? Make a guess. All right. Do you think it is for compatibility with older browsers? Do you think it's for compatibility with Ionic? Do you think it's for compatibility with NativeScript? Do you know how React Native works? OK, so Angular 2 can run not just on HTML, but on any template language. So you can implement your own what they call renderer. So you don't have to write to HTML only. So similar to Xamarin, there is a thing from Telerik, now Progress, called NativeScript. And NativeScript allows you to have a special XML language that they would translate to native elements for iOS, for Android, and I think they're now supporting WinForms as well. WinForm. So that's why when you get an element reference, you're not 100% sure, if it is a DOM element or not. Unless if you are, and if you are, you can just go and use the native element, and you're good. And now, let's go and see how this one looks like. It's just a directive with a selector, and you do whatever you want in the constructor, and that's it. That's very simple. That's you can think of this as your link function. Let's see how HTML side of things works. Now I'm going to tell you about all the kinds of syntax that you might use in a template. And it's very easy once you stop thinking with the Angular 1 mindset. So if you have an event, and you want to have an event handler for it, you use these brackets, which are like that, the circular ones, all right? And then the name of the event instead of the dots. Just like Angular 1, with the ng-click and all the other stuff, you get the event object, and you can use it. One interesting thing, though, is that everywhere in here, all the strings that you see, they're all JavaScript. So you don't need to worry about, does this directive support interpolation or not? Do I need to use this or not inside your attribute? So everywhere, whenever you're working with an attribute, you're working with this. And actually, you're never working with an attribute, but I'll explain this in a bit. So now, you already know this syntax for data binding, so I don't even need to explain it. Is it an event? Here it is. Is it an attribute? Then we just use the other brackets. And there is a very nice analogy to think about this one, which is, if that change is coming from the UI, from the user, and calling JavaScript code, then it's the circular one, is the event. If the change is in JavaScript code and is going to affect the UI, then it's the, what do you call it? What do you call these? Square brackets. You can tell I'm very prepared. So if you think about it this way, that the first one is coming from the UI to the JavaScript world, and that this guy is coming from JavaScript world to affect the UI, to affect the element, then you can very, very easily reason about this guy. This is two-way data binding. You would use it with forms only, obviously. And till today, I haven't really seen anything that uses it other than ng model. So now you know, like from the UI to the JavaScript, from JavaScript to the UI, or vice versa, you get this. So that's all good, except I lied to you about a very small thing. When I said that max length is an attribute, that was a lie. What we are dealing with in these square brackets, thanks Roseanne who reminded me of the name, it's always going to be a DOM element property. So I don't know if you guys are very familiar with this. If you have done a lot of jQuery code recently, like in the recent years, you'd realize the difference. So if you have a checkbox, and this checkbox has the attribute checked, then when it loads, it will be checked. If the user clicks the checkbox, then the checkbox is unchecked. And in this case, the property checked will be false, and the attribute checked will still be there. So the attribute is just what gets rendered in the text, but the property is the real value. So sometimes you might have different names for the attribute and the property. They're not always the same, and sometimes you would have a property that doesn't have an equivalent attribute, like styles, for example. And sometimes you'd have an attribute that might not have an equivalent property, like class. We should have class name. However, for simplicity, Angular 2 also gives you a few, like it does a little bit of a few tricks to make it easier for you to write this code. So for example, you don't have to do class name in here. The React guys would really like to have just being able to say class, because React works the same way. We are also dealing with properties, so you have to remember that you should write class name, and if you write class as a JavaScript reserved word, so it will not work. Here you just say, and you can say either you can set the entire class or you can set a conditional class. So warning will only be set if the if the length of the text is higher than half of the maximum length. I had to write it backwards to get the coloring to work, because it didn't work. And also, if Angular 2 has a reference to the element already, you might want to use it. Why don't you just go and use it? And yeah, you can just use it. So you use this, and you can give it a name, and you can, and this name input points to your input element, and you can use it like I'm using it in here. But the one element can have multiple directives, just like Angular 1. What if you want an instance of this directive? What if you want an instance of the ng model that we set in here? You can just use the same syntax, but by default it will be the same, the element or the component, because this could have been input or this could have been my app. But if you want to set it to a particular directive, you would use this. This will be useful when you're working with forms, for example, if you want to get a reference to the form, so you can say, dot is required, or they have a nice thing called dot value, which serializes all the values in the form and stuff like that. So now we know how to go from the element backwards to it. We can do a few hacks. So in addition to class, you also have dot attributes, which is just attr, and style. So you can go style.background.pixel and then set it to a number, and then that will just work. The last thing we have is template. So if we write this guy doesn't get written to the HTML just like it is. Instead, they write an HTML tag called template for you, and that's just a valid HTML5 tag. And then they will only write, the div if this condition is truthy. And similarly, this one also will get written to a template. And this is the only place, this ng4, that's the only place you write a special Angular 2 syntax. Everywhere else, you just write what's mostly plain JavaScript. Technically it's not, but like you can think about it exactly like any JavaScript expression. Here is the only place you'd have like a special syntax, and they were really trying to avoid it when they started, but So how do you recognize that it is a template? The star, exactly. So right now, the whole point of the template syntax, if you're wondering why is it like that, is to eliminate guesses. So now, I know this is an event. If in Angular 1, the main problem with the directives was if you see it, you don't know what it does. But here, it's an event handler. You know that you're setting a property. You know that this is just an identifier. You know this is going to rewrite the tag. So it's mainly to eliminate guesses, and when you work with it that way, it's very nice. One more thing that you'll find that you really know, it's not anything weird at all, is filters or pipes. As usual, just like the component, and the directive, you get a TypeScript directive, and you just give it the name that you're going to use in just like a sync in the other example that we saw. If you want to make sure that you implement your variable, that you implement the right function, you can implement the interface, and this will just make sure that I'm writing it right. And here you just get the value, and you can use it. Nothing special in here. Routing. Routing is one of the a little bit silly parts of Angular 2, because they had a router, and then they deprecated it, and then they had another router, which didn't live for like one release or something, and then there's a lucky cert, and that's what we're dealing with now, and it's not likely to change, so you don't need to worry about that much. They had 3 goals with the router. First, it needs to support Angular 2 and Angular 1, because that's going to be the story for the migration. So what you do if you have an Angular 1 application is that you would work like you would migrate to this router first with all your Angular 1, and then step by step start moving your Angular 1 components or your Angular 1 routes into Angular 2 and move on. The second one is they want to support lazy loading of some routes, which would be optional. So sometimes, yeah, I want to load all this on page load, and I want to lazy load only the admin section, for example. The third thing is it needs to support bundling, as in, so they have this thing called offline compiler, which would be able to take all your component, all the data in it, and just take it in one piece. And the router needed to deal with that as well. If you don't get what I'm saying for this one, we'll be talking in more details about it in a bit. So the routes, what I want to show you now is that it's quite simple in the sense of you define a thing that's of type route config. And why would you say that it is of type route config? So that you'd get IntelliSense for path and for component and redirect to and all this sort of stuff. TypeScript would automatically understand this. So here we're saying, for the if there is no path at all, and that's why we're saying the path match in here, because path match like it can be. I might just say, I want the path match to be anything customer / anything, anything that matches partially customers. And then we're saying, okay, go to the customers, which just defines the component. Who can tell what's the part that I omitted in here, like I didn't include? In order to reference the customer component, I need to import it as well. So, I just didn't include the import. This is like the using statements. Here, there's another example. If you have children, you just set them this way, and it's really not that much different from what you used to do. And instead of ng content, you just have a router outlet, and that's it. So now we talked about TypeScript as the main thing that Angular introduced. We realized that everything else is quite similar. Maybe dependency injection changed a bit. Yeah. Now we'll talk about the other new concept that is not specific to Angular 2, but a lot of us got introduced to only in Angular 2, which is observables. Observables are the marriage of promises and events and scope.broadcast. So events are asynchronous, right? You don't know when the event is going to happen. So it has to be asynchronous. So if you have add event listener, the function will be invoked asynchronously sometime in the future. However, events, they can be fired more than once. So that's different from a promise. A promise will just resolve and that's it. In the same way, if you want to raise your own event in Angular 1, the way you would use it is that, like you would say, scope.emit or scope.broadcast, and then somewhere else would have scope.on and try to listen to it. Now, all of this has been replaced by this one thing called observables, and let's see what observables look like. So observables allow you to subscribe to them, and when you subscribe, you get multiple values. So here, the way I'm defining this observable by hand, which is something you rarely do, when you say create, it gives you a thing called observer, and the thing called observer, what it does is it's like, I'm going to raise this event. I'm scope.broadcast. And then you can say, okay, send this value now, trigger this event. Trigger this other event with this value. When you are done, complete. So what this is going to do is, because I'm calling it in a set timeout, it's going to wait for 2 seconds and then directly pass these two independently and then say, I'm done. One thing that you can't do with promises, but you can do with observables, is that you can cancel them as well. So whenever somebody subscribes to this observable, which is the equivalent of the then for promises, we can return a subscription, and they can call unsubscribe on it, which will call our clear method. So a funny thing in promises, for example, is in HTTP, because in Angular 1, HTTP used promises. If you make an HTTP request, you cannot cancel it. It will have to come back, and you will have to, in the then of this promise, make sure that you're going to discard it somehow. Even though the actual Ajax API, like the DOM API, supports aborting the XML HTTP request. But because it's trapped in a promise, you can't access that. Now, HTTP in Angular 2 uses observables, so you can easily cancel, you can easily debounce, you can easily do a lot of things. As I told you, normally you wouldn't be creating observables like that. You can just take any value and make it an observable. You can call an observable on some interval, so it keeps repeating after a while. You can convert any promise, event, Ajax request into an observable. If you have an array, you can get each item to be called. So these examples that I'm looking at, what's going to do is it's going to have an observable that's going to give me a number every half a second. But then I'm going to have another observable that will only fire for the first 10 numbers. And here I'm having a third observable that will only fire for the even numbers of this. And that's the real power of observables, that you can compose them. So you can have one request and compose it with other values and stuff like that. So actually, these functions, they call them operators, and there are tons of them. And they're just like link when you think about it. Map is like select. Do is just like for each. But there are also a few more interesting things. You might have noticed in the first example of the observables, I threw an error. So if this is an Ajax, you can have a retry, and you can have, for the retry, you can have it based on a function or based on a specific number of retries. You can tell it, don't give me any results until there is a new value. You can redirect, you can return a completely different observable. So here's an example of using observables and of using services as well at the same time. So services in Angular 2, because that's a very quick one, services are just plain classes, any classes. You don't even need this injectable thing. However, if you want to use dependency injection, then Angular will need to know about your constructor method. And the only way Angular would know this is that it needs some attribute to be written on the class. When TypeScript sees any attribute, so this injectable thing in particular, it does nothing. It's just so that we would have something on the class, so the TypeScript, if you set the right config, which in all the projects of Angular 2, they get set for you by default, they will write all the arguments of the constructor in the generated JavaScript. So then Angular can use a thing called reflect metadata and do a little bit of reflection and know, what arguments do I need, and just include them. Back to observables. Here, what this service does, it gets the list of repositories for the GitHub usernames that you send. So now I have a username. I'm using the TypeScript strings here, so that I construct my URL, and I'm returning an observable of iRepository. And this observable, all it does is that it just uses the HTTP, which got injected from here, and we already know that when we have an access modifier, I can call it with this. So just said, okay, get that, and then map it to here. What you get from the get is just an observable of HTTP response. You probably want the data, you don't want the whole response. So here we call a handy function that Angular 2 gives you on the response that just converts it into a JSON. And while I'm here, why don't I just cast it? And that's the syntax for casting in TypeScript. Why don't I cast it in this so that, TypeScript will automatically infer that the return will become this. I don't need to write it in there. And then if there is an error, in this case, I'm just dealing with it a little bit naively, and I'm just returning an empty array. One more thing that kind of, it did change in Angular 2, but you most likely don't have to deal with it, is how change tracking works. And actually, Angular 2 started from here. It started from this library called Zone.js. So I think it was Mishku from the Angular team, like he was the one who invented Angular 1. He had this crazy idea, which is saying, okay, and instead of doing all this scope.digest and stuff, the only way something is going to change in the document is that if, and I wouldn't know about it, is that if it happened asynchronously. There are only a few APIs in the DOM that can do that, like add event listener or an AJAX call or set timeout or set interval and stuff. How about if I have a library that can go and replace all these functions in the browser with its own functions that would just call the change detection for me after the synchronous thing finishes. At first, sounds like a crazy idea. Well, this thing, overriding native APIs in the browser used to be like a no kind of thing. Surprisingly, it works very well. So it's like, oh yeah, that's nice. Let's use this. And now this kind of was the first seed that I know of where Angular 2 started coming. That okay, our change tracking is very slow. It is the one that's holding us back. Why don't we make it faster by just making it close to the bare metal? But that's not the only thing. When Angular 2 sees the templates that we looked at, it generates some JavaScript for you, right? So this JavaScript that it generates, it's not generic code. So if I say in my template, add this username, it doesn't just say, okay, there is this key, is username an object, is a string, is an array, no, it doesn't do that. Because TypeScript gives it enough static information, it just goes ahead and writes the specific API, the specific comparison of this argument that you use in your template. And this means there's no generic code, so the code is really, really fast. It doesn't have to go through a million of possibilities to just know how to compare an object, because it already knows what it is. And this made Angular 2 really very, very fast. And that's not the only option. So they have this thing called change tracking strategy. So maybe you want to say, don't run change tracking for me. If I care about something, I'll just subscribe to an observable. I want to be very fast. I want to be very explicit about how I do change tracking. That's also supported, no problem. And this whole thing starts with what's included in Angular 2, the platform. First, the template compiler. If you are wondering why Angular 2 is not released, this is the thing, that once this thing is finished, we'll get Angular 2. So what's this? Now, you saw in the very first Angular 2 example, we had this import from browser, dynamic browser and stuff. And that's because what the Angular team want to do and what they already did in some unofficial repositories is they want to be able to take your HTML template and convert it into JavaScript, just like the same way that template compilation happens in Angular 1. except that this JavaScript, would be very specific about the attributes and the properties that you're using, so to be much, much faster, and then write the JavaScript code into what they call template factories, and just store it so that now, once you converted the HTML to JavaScript, it's not just that you don't need the HTML templates anymore. You don't even need the compiler from Angular 2 anymore. So they can omit this from your bundle, and your application becomes much, much, much slower. Not slower. Much faster. So these are the things that they want. And these are the things that kind of contradicts with the lazy loading when you think about it. And that's why the router was quite a big question for them. So a lot of people ask me, like, when do you expect Angular 2 to ship? I do not know, but I kind of guess that they should get this going by maybe end of September, early October, kind of. And now, how about, now we knew how to optimize the compilation, but how about the change tracking? How about the stuff that you can't avoid running in runtime? Well, the web has a thing called web workers. That's like threads for JavaScript, multiple threads that can run in the background. Why don't you just use this? Yeah, you can. So Angular 2 already implements an example that shows you can run the whole Angular work in web workers, so that even if it's slow, even if it's doing something slow, it's not blocking the rendering UI. But if you're running it in the background already, if you can separate it from the DOM, why don't you run it on the server? Why don't you run it in React Native or NativeScript or whatever? So that's kind of the big picture that they want. I want to be able to run Angular applications even offline. Why wouldn't I be able to run it offline? Because now there's another thing called service workers, not web workers, that can run even if the page is not opened. That would be useful for mobiles. So I can go to your website. You can show me a dialog. Do you want to just put a shortcut to our website on your home screen? And then I click that, but the 3G is not working well. So the service worker will run, and okay, yeah, you're offline. I'll put some resources for you offline that I cached before, and you just work with it. So that's one story for mobile. And the other story, obviously, is Ionic, which is exactly as similar as you would imagine it in Ionic 1. The other mobile story is also NativeScript, but that's not everything in there. One thing I want you to know about Angular 2 that's different from Angular 1 is that Angular 1, it was very unopinionated. So people were doing Angular apps in completely different ways, and unfortunately, even like the right way, that you'd ask the team and would say the right way, it changed. Like today, in Angular 1.5, you should be using components all the way, because it will make it very similar to Angular 2. But just a little bit before, you were supposed to use controller as with the directives. And just before, it was no, only use controllers and use directives only for DOM manipulation. There was no way. Angular 2 is quite opinionated to the extent that it prefers a certain directory structure. Notice that I use the word prefers. It doesn't force you to do that, but if you follow the style guide, you'll be doing exactly like everyone else, so you'll be able to work with anyone else on any Angular project, same conventions, same naming conventions, same folder, same everything. It's very easy to work with stuff. And that's why they even created a CLI tool, a command line tool, that will just generate things following the style guide for you. One more piece of what they're including as well is a debugging tool. So who here used Batarang? So it's a Chrome development tool. I'll be showing it to you now. Why don't we just skip the schedule and do this? Come on, internet. Internet, hello. Okay, cool. So now this is a website that just shows the tool. It's called Augury, and now I can go in here. What you might not notice is I have a new tab in my developer tools called Augury, and now I can see all my components. And once I go to this component, for example, I can see what dependencies it has. I can see what state it has, and I can even change it. So if I say here, input data, change it. It got changed here and here, everywhere where binding works. And even I have routing. I can have a routing tree. So that's very nice. Going back here. We were talking about mobile. As I told you, the whole thing about mobile is I told you about service workers. I told you about the ability to run offline. However, the way you would do this, you'd have to write some files called manifest and work with some very ugly APIs that a lot of developers don't like. So if you are using the CLI, or if you just want to use the guidance and apply it to your own project manually, you can go to mobile.angular.io and they will help you avoid all the ugly APIs and just work directly and get all the benefits of your application running from the home screen, just like a normal application and working offline and everything. But to do this, it will be always easier for you to follow the conventions. So things like, okay, I want to have my component, I want to have a test for it, so the test should be component.spec.ts and so on. And these conventions you get for free if you use the CLI. You don't really have to use the CLI. I have seen Steve Sanderson show some great stuff running with human generators that they have in ASP.NET Core for the node services, but you want to make sure that you follow the style guide, even if you're not using the CLI. The CLI I've been very fond of it recently. It's very simple. You just create a new project, and then you can generate. The G is for generate. You can generate a component, a service, an interface, and it will generate everything for you, and then you can have it running with live reload, and you can create a production bundle. And here, this is going to be why you really want to use the CLI, because that's where the Angular 2 team is going to give you automatically the offline compiler and the tree shaking, excluding any part of Angular 2 or of your code that you're not using to make your bundle smaller. Right now, the bundle, the production version of a Hello World application is 100-something kilobytes, close to 200. However, there are unofficial attempts and official unreleased attempts that got this into 23 kilobytes, which is ridiculous. So and that's the whole Angular and your own code for a Hello World and the polyfills that they include because they rely on a lot of ES6 features and Zone.js itself is considered a polyfill because it's now introduced, it's now coming as part of the a proposal for the ECMAScript standard to be part of the standard, not just Angular. So if you use the CLI, it will use the NGC, the Angular compiler under the hood, and will do. It used to be working with SystemJS. Just recently, they moved into Webpack, which makes it much easier for them to do what they call tree shaking. That's the dead code removal. We already talked about Augury. But again, there is a lot of things that are happening. They're working closely with Telerik for the native script story, and I've seen React Native stuff working with Angular 2. Ionic also are working very, very closely with Angular 2, that they're both going to release almost at the same time, most likely at the same time. And you can even use Angular 2 because you already have the offline capabilities and everything. So you can also even create desktop applications with it using Electron. Why not? So where are we now? There is a release 4 going on. I'm expecting RC5 to be any time now. There were a few things that were blocking it, because one thing I forgot to write in this slide is that you also have a lot of the usual stuff that you used to get with Angular 1, like internationalization, animation, and stuff like that. So there was an important bug with animation that is now in the repository waiting to be shipped with RC5. There are people who are using Google Closure Compiler to get Angular 2 applications to crazy small things, although in your own experience, you'll not get that. I think the standard application in dev mode will be about 2 megabytes. If you build prod, you'll get about close to 200 kilobytes. But we have seen examples that go to 25, 23, and 20. However, there's one big thing that's going to happen that will make you Angular 1 guys feel like, okay, it's all the same. They're going to have modules just like Angular 1. So at first, they were like, we don't need to make our own modules. ES 215, we're cool. However, now they realize, I need to know which components I need to pre-compile with the offline compiler and include in this bundle, and which components to lazy load. And even when the components I lazy load, they'll have their own providers and services and other related components. So how would I call a bundle of stuff that should be compiled together? And that is going to be app modules. That's a big thing that's going to happen before the release to enable the work for the router and the ng compiler to happen. And if you, the best way to know about this is if you follow the weekly meeting notes for the Angular team. So would you like to see what the CLI tool gives us? Do we have time? We're over time already, so I'm not sure if anybody would like to see that. Maybe after lunch, come and I'll show you what structure it gives. Or you know what? Let's just go very, very, very quickly into this. So what you get is just a packages to JSON with all the required modules, because that's the silly thing about being too modular is that you get too many modules. And it gives you the proper TypeScript configuration. That's a thing called tsconfig to JSON, which already uses the very, very latest version of TypeScript that's still in beta, TypeScript 2. And then all your app is here in the app folder, source app folder. Everything starts with the index the main. And that's where you have your own bootstrapping, and then it includes the app component for you. So it generates the app component by default when you say new. Also, it includes Selenium-like code that's using the protractor framework. I don't think many have been using it for Angular 1, but it already generates it, and it generates it in a very nice way, because this is a page object. So your test will just use it, the page object, which wraps the actual selectors. It's just Selenium. It uses Selenium under the hood. And you might have heard Scott Allen say, oh, I have to include browser and include so many to run this. Latest version of Protractor saves you most of the imports. You see all the describe and before each and it, I didn't need to include them. The only thing I did really was just the page object. And also it gives you, and this is a little bit of a hidden gem, it gives you this public folder. Anything you put in here will be copied as is to your version, like your production version that you include. And this is very useful for me for demos. If I want to simulate calling a JSON API without really having a node server or whatever, I just put a JSON file in here and call it. Unfortunately, I won't be able to show much because of the time, but you can go to gurustop.net and just enter your email. I'll be sending a few links related to a couple of free books for Angular 2. And you can come and talk to me. I'm having a lot of people asking for some private Angular 2 workshop and just trying to figure out the logistics, how to do that. So if you are interested, talk to me to include you in that. Make sure to come to the Angular 2 session after the break for more advanced version of what I've been saying. And yeah, if you want to talk to me, I'll be around the Redify booth in the other floor. I think that's it. You must be too tired. Thank you.